At this time, I'd like to call Mr. Christopher Marzilli to the podium. Chris is the Executive Vice President of General Dynamics, and he'll have the pleasure of introducing the next part of our program.
Thank you, and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. A terrific venue, a compelling cause, an absolutely wonderful, wonderful place this evening. So it's an honor to join these distinguished titans of diplomacy as we commemorate the fall of the Berlin Wall. I want to begin by thanking the Diplomacy Center Foundation for the important work it is doing to honor the contribution of American diplomats and preserve the history for future generations. Looking back, November 9th, 1989 was a pinnacle day in history, but it took time to understand the magnitude of that moment. It's a moment that stands as a tribute to the resilient work, to the incredible men and women behind the diplomatic mission. The people who promote the national security, economic prosperity, and global leadership of the United States. The people in this room and on the front lines all over the world. It's a mission that never stops. Today, the United States and its allies have new complexities to navigate, different adversaries, and new global threats. The pace of the technology change has made the world smaller and presented new opportunities, but it also added new complexities. New battlefields have emerged within cyberspace. And while the tools have changed, the mission has not. General Dynamics Information Technology is proud to support the mission from operating global supply chains, securing diplomatic facilities around the world, to delivering cybersecurity innovation. We truly understand the challenges. We are proud to support this work every day and all over the world. And tonight I have the privilege of introducing former Secretary of State Jim Baker and Mr. David Rubenstein. David Rubenstein has been a co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group since 1987, one of the world's largest and most successful private investment firms. Before he founded the Carlyle Group in 1987, he served as Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy during the Carter administration from 1977 to 1981. Mr. Rubenstein was also Chief Counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments. He is Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Rubenstein is also the host of the David Rubenstein Show, peer-to-peer conversations that's featured on Bloomberg TV and PBS. Secretary Baker's career in public service and politics stands unparalleled, having served as the Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, and twice as White House Chief of Staff for Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Long active in American presidential politics, Secretary Baker led presidential campaigns for Presidents Ford, Reagan, and Bush over the course of 5 consecutive presidential elections from 1976 to 1992. Secretary Baker served as the nation's 61st Secretary of State from January 1989 through August of 1992 under President George H.W. Bush, when the United States confronted unprecedented challenges and opportunities around the world during the post-Cold War era. As Secretary of State, he was influential in overseeing American foreign policy during a time in which the Cold War ended peacefully. The Soviet Union was dissolved and democracy spread across the globe. Following the fall of the Berlin Wall, he laid the groundwork for unification of Germany. Following his tenure as Secretary of State, Secretary Baker continued to stay actively engaged in U.S. diplomacy and international affairs. In 1993, he founded the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. Today, Secretary Baker is a senior partner in the law firm of Baker Botts, serves on the board of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, He's also a major supporter of the National Museum of American Diplomacy and serves as honorary co-chair on the board of directors for Diplomacy Center Foundation. On behalf of General Dynamics Information Technology, thank you again for having me here this evening. It is now my honor to introduce Secretary Baker and David Rubenstein.
Thank you very much, Secretary Baker. And I should say that you have a distinguished career, but the most important part of your career was left out of that bio, which was that after you left your tenure in the government, you affiliated with a firm that I have, and you were indispensable to our going from one of the smallest private equity firms in the world to one of the largest private equity firms in the world. So thank you for doing that. And when we traveled the world together many times, and I'll go through some of those things that we did, but why do you, normally former secretaries of state or former government officials, they would show up for dinners or they might make speeches, but they don't actually give a lot of their money to causes the way you have. Why have you become one of the largest cash donors to this museum?
Well, David, because I had the cash to give thanks to you.
Well,
now having said that, having given you a shout out like that, I ought to also tell this audience that you're one of the reasons that I was able to become White House Chief of Staff for Ronald Reagan, because you worked for Jimmy Carter.
Right.
And
You're
had
right.
you not,
look, our career intersected this way. I worked for Jimmy Carter, and you were working for Gerald Ford, and at that time, Carter won. 4 years later, you got to repay the favor, and so you did pretty well. But you told me over the years that of all the jobs you've ever had, the best job that you can have is Secretary of State.
absolutely.
And you said it's
I was just discussing that with the current Secretary of State.
right.
Absolutely. Best job in government. Worst job in government is White House Chief of Staff.
Right.
I did that twice, and it's terrible.
But you would rather have been Secretary of State than President of the United States?
Well, I think it's a better job.
Okay.
I mean, you're a little bit removed from the political centrifuge, not totally, but I'm not saying I would rather have been Secretary of State. You know, George Bush used to have a way. George Bush said, the one thing I like about Jim Baker is he'll tell me what he thinks, even though he knows I don't want to hear it. And I tell people that's true, but he had a very effective way of letting me know when the discussion was over, when we were arguing about a policy or something. He would look at me and say, Baker, if you're so smart, why am I president and you're not?
So on one of our trips overseas, we met with then Crown Prince Abdullah, who later became King of Saudi Arabia. Now, as you obviously know, during the effort to get rid of Saddam Hussein and kick him out of Kuwait, you raised a lot of money for that. We financed the war. How much did you actually raise for that effort to
Well,
finance
my
that war?
recollection is the war cost the United States about 65 or 70 billion dollars, and we raised all but 10 of that from some of the countries that we were helping.
All right. So
And
when
now
we
remember, we were a Republican administration with a completely Democratic Congress, House and Senate. So we didn't have a lot of support initially when we said we wanted to reverse a right to aggression. The word was, how can you do that, spend that money when we have all these social problems here in the United States? I finally went to the president and said, Heffy, we got to figure out a way to combat this. Maybe we can pass a tin cup around and get some of these people we're helping to pay for it. And we did. And I think it's the only war America has ever fought that we didn't pay for.
Now, you said you called him Effie. I know that you did. What did that mean? Why did you call him that? You used to call him that.
I always called him President, Mr. President, when anybody else was in the room. But of course, I called him George most of our lives because we were close friends. But after he left office, I started calling him Jefe, which in Spanish, of course, is chief.
So when we went to see then Crown Prince Abdullah after the war, we had a meeting with him, and he said, you overcharged me by $5 or $6 billion. I want that money back.
Yeah.
I thought it was tongue-in-cheek, and you told me, no, it wasn't tongue-in-cheek.
No, it wasn't tongue-in-cheek. No,
So he was serious about trying to get the money back, right?
no, I don't think he was serious in letting me know. He thought that I'd been too tough on him. But, we got $15 billion from, I went to the Saudis first, and they said, what are you getting from the Kuwaitis? And I said, well, we haven't done that yet. They said, you go talk to the Kuwaitis and then come back and see us. So I went up to Taif, Saudi Arabia, where the Kuwaiti government was in exile because Iraq, Saddam's troops occupied Kuwait. And we got the Kuwaitis to pony up $15 billion. And so I went back and the Saudis ponied up $15 billion.
So,
But he wasn't king at the time. That was King Fahd.
I know, he was,
And King Fahd said, you don't need to put a figure on, just tell me what you want, you got it.
oh, you ever meet a lot of people that do that? That's
Not
pretty
too many.
good.
Not too many.
So when you were famous for many things during that period of time, running around looking for the money and so forth, putting the coalition together. But there was a meeting, I think, in Geneva with you and the foreign minister of Iraq, and you gave him a letter from President Bush, and
Right,
he didn't take it. Did you think that they were ever going to back down? And why do you think they did not back down when they saw the American military getting ready to
I
invade?
can't answer why they didn't. We used to say Saddam would always take things right up to the brink, and he may have thought that the brink was further away than we were telling him it was. We didn't tell him the exact day that the balloon would go up, but we said it's going to be pretty soon. And for some reason he didn't take his troops out.
So many years when we were going around the world on various business things, and you were doing a lot of speeches and so forth, the most frequent question you were asked was, why after the Kuwait War did you not go to Baghdad and end Saddam Hussein's life? And what was your answer then?
Well, we got a lot of heat for that, but President Bush was wise enough to know that, and by the way, our military didn't want any part of occupying that big Arab country. But President Bush was wise enough to know that if we did that, we'd own it, and we'd have to figure out what we were going to do with it. And it was several years or so before people concluded that we'd done the right thing. After the invasion in 2003, and when we did go to Baghdad, and you saw what happened, people said, well, maybe it wasn't so smart to do that.
Now, when the Berlin Wall fell, many people said to you and to President Bush, why don't you take credit for getting the wall to go down and say you ended the Cold War and take credit? I mean, Washington is not lacking in people sometimes who want to take credit for things, so why didn't you take credit for it?
Well, President Bush got a lot of heat for not being more emotional about the collapse of the wall, but his view was, and it was the right view, we still had a lot of business to do with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, and it wouldn't have been very smart for us to stick our finger in their eye because we still had a lot of things to do. For instance, we had to find a way to unify Germany. We had to do a whole host of other things. So while the president took a lot of heat for it, it was the right policy approach.
So in being Secretary of State, what would you say is the most difficult part of being Secretary of State? Is it dealing with the Congress, the White House, the National Security Council? What's the biggest challenge?
Well, it depends on what the arrangements are when you're secretary. It could be all of those things and has been for some secretaries. I was really lucky because I was a Secretary of State for a guy who'd been my friend for 40 years, and I'd run all of his political campaigns, so nobody was going to get between me and my president, and he was godfather to my daughter, so I had a little bit of a leg up. And any Secretary of State, to be successful, has got to stay pretty close to have a seamless relationship, if he can, with his president. And I was really fortunate in that regard because I didn't have to work at that.
So when you became Secretary of State, did you get advice from previous secretaries that
I did.
And what was the best piece of advice you got?
Stay close to your president.
Okay? All right?
Here's the thing. People don't understand this. The president and Secretary of State are sharing the nation's foreign policy responsibility. And the president always outranks the Secretary of State. So you better find a way to do that that's compatible with the interests of the president.
So since you have left,
Or resign.
since you've left as Secretary of State, many future secretary, then new Secretaries of State come in. Do they call you for advice? And what do you normally say to them as the best advice
The
you give
same
them?
thing I just said here.
Stay close to the president.
Stay close to your president.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. And that's what I told Secretary Pompeo when he called me about 20 minutes after his appointment was announced. And we had a very good meeting at the CIA.
So you met many foreign leaders in the course of your time as Secretary of State, 4 years, and then, of course, you were Secretary of Treasury for 4 years and Chief of Staff for 4 years. Who was the most impressive foreign leader you ever met?
Well, that's a hard one because I met some very impressive ones. You know, I think Mikhail Gorbachev is going to be treated very well by history because he made the decision not to use force to keep the empire together, something that had never been done before. And he was, and he had a very difficult problem. He was attacking this way and that, and was being attacked domestically by some of the people in the Soviet Union. He was very interesting. Dealing, I guess, with Hafiz al-Assad of Syria was interesting to say the least. We'd have these meetings in this tiny little closed room that had bulletproof windows and olive drab curtains. And he'd sit you there and ply you with fruit drinks to the point that you had to give up because you had to go to the men's room. And I wrote a chapter in my memoirs about my time as Secretary of State that's entitled "Bladder Diplomacy," and that was my time spent with Hafiz Assad. And those were long sessions. He'd start out every session by lecturing you on the exploits of Salah ad-Din.
I think that you also pointed out that you had to sit here and he was sitting there. You're looking this way, but you're supposed to talk this way. Why didn't they move the chairs like this?
I don't know, because they were great, big, heavy armchairs, and I got a crick in my neck every time I met with him.
Now, the leader of Israel was one of the people you were closest to, I think.
Well, I actually was pretty close to him, but we disagreed on policy, on many policy issues, because he was a hardline minister. We were opposed to settlements, as all American administrations have been, Republican and Democratic. And we both saw to it that all of our meetings were just the two of us, no note takers, no nothing. And he never leaked on me. I never leaked on him. His word was good. My word to him was good. We disagreed on policy.
And one of the people you had a
His name was Itzhak Shamir.
But his successor,
Itzhak Rabin,
was also one of your closest allies.
Yeah, he and a close friend.
So Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of Russia, was also one of the people you had developed a close relationship. How did you do that with somebody from Russia? So how did you develop that relationship?
Shevardnadze had been an apparatchik for the Soviet Union in Georgia when he was coming up through. And after my first meeting with him actually was when I was Treasury Secretary. I went over to the White House for a lunch that President Reagan gave, and the new Soviet foreign minister was there, Shevardnadze. And I met him there, and when I first became Secretary of State, all of our meetings were very, very formal ministerials with two big long tables and Soviet Union flags and U.S. flags and everything. We finally changed that format, and we went to one that became more personal and more intimate, so to speak. And I invited him to Wyoming. The Soviets were not allowed to go beyond 25 miles from their embassy in Washington or their offices at the UN. And we took Shevardnadze and his delegation to the mountains of Wyoming, and they loved it. And we negotiated a chemical weapons treaty there that I think we still are parties to. We haven't left that, have we yet, Mike?
So,
still looking, right?
so one of the biggest challenges of being a Secretary of State is something called jet lag. How do you deal with jet lag?
I took something called Halcyon, and then the FDA came out and said, "This will kill you. This stuff will kill you."
Okay.
But I really had a good response from it. I could get 6 hours of really good sleep. Of course, I had a very comfortable bed on my plane, just like Secretary here does. And I would go between meetings. I'd go in and take a house in and tap out.
Some people say the plane for the Secretary of State is very old, like 40 years old, and needs a new plane. You have any comments on that?
I think the current Secretary of State is better equipped to answer that than I am. I had a very interesting plane for my plane. I had the plane that Lyndon Johnson was sworn in on after Jack Kennedy was killed in Dallas. 26,000. That was the Secretary of State's plane in those days. And then, of course, when I was Reagan's chief of staff, we ordered the new Air Force One, 747, first time that it ever gone up 747. It didn't arrive until after George H.W. became president.
So you're one of the few people who have worked for Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George Herbert Walker Bush, and knew them all very well. So how would you contrast their working style in the Oval Office? Who was easier to convince of something?
That's
who
a
was
nice
harder?
try, David. I've never been...
What?
You know, I get that question all the time, and I tell people I don't compare the presidents I work for, because the minute you say something nice about one of them, it's going to be interpreted to be something nasty.
All right, well, let me just ask you this way. What was it like being chief of staff for Ronald Reagan? Was that fun, not fun, terrible?
No, it was tough. It was tough because I was constantly under attack by the so-called true believers. You got to remember that I ran 2 campaigns against Reagan. And then he asked me to be his White House chief of staff. Now, I defy you to tell me when that's going to happen again in American politics. I don't think that's going to happen again.
Right.
But he was a lovely person to work for, really. But I was constantly being attacked by the so-called true believers. Took a long while for a lot of them to accept me. They finally concluded that my loyalties had transferred from George H.W. Bush to Ronald Reagan, and they accepted me.
So previous secretaries of state who served before you, were there some long time ago or not so long ago that you admired from, Thomas Jefferson on? Were there any secretaries of state you saw as role models?
I've often told people that my friend George Shultz went to Princeton University. I went to Princeton University. George Shultz was a Marine. I was a Marine. George Shultz was Secretary of the Treasury. I was Secretary of the Treasury. And George Shultz was Secretary of State, and I was Secretary of State. So he ought to be my mentor, and he was.
Okay. So what does the Baker Institute do?
We try to bridge the gap between the world of action, on the one hand, people like you and I who served in government and done things, and the academics. Rice, of course, is a very, very fine school academically. And I stole that mission statement from the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars here in the Smithsonian, because I was the longest serving trustee of the Woodrow Wilson Center. I served in all the various capacities, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, statutory service, and then as appointed by President Ford on his way out. And so what we do is we try to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of action, and we endow fellowships for people from the world of action, bring them in and give them a assignment of 2 or 3 years, something like that. They interface with the academics,
Right.
and we've got a pretty good reputation.
What are you most proud of having accomplished in your public life? Is it something as Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Chief of Staff?
I told somebody this earlier tonight. I'm most proud of the fact that I ran those campaigns, 5 campaigns for President of the United States. I served 12 years up here in Washington, and I left unindicted.
One time after you left here, you went back to Texas and you considered running for Attorney General.
I did run.
You did run.
I did
and then
run.
you told me once that somebody came up to you once and said something like, you look like Jim Baker. I can't remember exactly what that story was. Can you remember somebody?
Yeah. After I'd run Ford's campaign, I got a lot of television time on national television as Ford's chairman. And then I went back to Texas and filed to run for Attorney General of Texas. George Bush told me to run for governor. He said, you're not going to be able to get any attention for a down-ballot race as a Republican in Texas, because Texas was a solidly Democratic state. I disregarded the advice. I shouldn't have if I wanted to win, but fortunately I didn't win. Otherwise, I would never have been able to come up here. And I ran for Attorney General thinking that because I was a better lawyer than my opponent, that would make a difference. That doesn't make any difference in politics. So you asked me.
Somebody came up to you and said,
Yeah.
"You look
So
like
here
Jim
I am.
Baker."
I've gotten all this FaceTime on national television. I'm walking down an airport concourse somewhere, and somebody comes to me. I know you. I know you. He's recognized the face, but he can't come up with the name. He said, "You're Jim Baker." I said, "That's right." I was swelled up with pride, and I said, "Yes, I am Jim Baker." He said, "I knew it." He said, "And how's Tammy Faye?" The other
one was one time somebody said, "Go ahead."
The other thing that happened was somebody said, "You look like," did anybody ever tell you you look like Jim Baker? And I said, "Yes." He said, "Doesn't it piss you off?" So that's the first clue I had. I might not be the Attorney General of Texas.
Let me just tell, if I could, before we finish, one Gorbachev story. You knew Gorbachev reasonably well, I would say.
Yeah.
And very impressive in what he accomplished. So just to show you the quick wit he had, he went to the Kennedy School once at Harvard, and he was asked by students, how would history have been different if Nikita Khrushchev had been killed in November of 1963 and not John Kennedy? Without missing a beat, he said, look, nobody can tell how history would really be changed, but I can tell you one thing for certain. Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. So, Mr. Secretary, you have a career in public service that really is unmatched by anybody over the last 50 years or so. So, as American, I want to thank you for what you've done for our country, and thank you very much for what you've done for this museum. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.